The moment Nora Aldridge stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1878, 3 different people warned her about Isaac Whitfield before she had even collected her trunk from the luggage rack. The first was the stagecoach driver, a heavy-set man named Dooley who kept his hat pulled low against the desert wind. He leaned down from his seat and spoke in a low, serious tone, as if he were passing along information that might one day save her life. He told her that Isaac Whitfield was a man who had ridden with outlaws in his younger years, that he had a temper carved from granite, and that the ranch on the eastern edge of town was a place decent women did not visit alone. The second was a woman at the general store, Mrs. Crane, who had the sharp eyes of someone who had watched the whole territory age and fade around her. She pressed her lips into a thin line when Nora mentioned the Whitfield name, and she told her in a brisk, businesslike manner that the man had never been properly civilized, that he barely came into town except to collect supplies, and that his last hired hand had left without collecting his final week's wages, which she considered a very telling sign about the conditions out there. The third warning came from the town's deputy sheriff, a young man named Garrett who had the earnest, slightly worried face of someone who took his responsibilities very personally. He found Nora sitting on the bench outside the telegraph office, reading the letter she had received 3 weeks ago in Santa Fe, the one that had brought her all the way out here. He tipped his hat and asked if she was the woman who had responded to the advertisement for a housekeeper at the Whitfield Ranch, and when she said yes, he sat down beside her without being invited and told her, quietly and without apparent malice, that Isaac Whitfield was not a dangerous man in the way that outlaws are dangerous, but that he was complicated, solitary, and difficult to understand, and that she should go in with her eyes wide open. Nora thanked each of them politely, and then, when the borrowed wagon arrived to carry her and her trunk to the ranch, she climbed up onto the seat and rode east without a moment of hesitation. She was 26 years old, a widow of 14 months, and she had learned very early in her life that the warnings of careful people tended to say more about the people giving them than about the subject of their concern. Her late husband, Thomas Aldridge, had been considered a perfectly safe and acceptable man by everyone who knew him, and he had been neither particularly safe nor especially acceptable to live with. She had spent 5 years in a house in Santa Fe learning how to disappear inside herself, how to make herself small and quiet and useful, and when Thomas died of a fever in February of 1877, she had spent 14 months trying to figure out who she was when no one was watching. The advertisement had caught her eye because it was so plainly written. Most advertisements for domestic help in the territory used flowery language about comfortable accommodations and fair wages and an agreeable household. This one said only that a working ranch outside of Harlan's Crossing required a capable housekeeper who could cook, manage a household, and tolerate long stretches of solitude. It listed a wage that was more than fair. It said to write to I. Whitfield, Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico Territory, and leave it at that. She had written. He had written back, a short letter in firm, steady handwriting that confirmed the position and told her the date he needed her to arrive. No pleasantries, no embellishments. She had appreciated the honesty of it. The ranch sat at the edge of a wide, flat stretch of land where the desert began to give way to something rougher and more interesting, where red rock formations rose out of the earth like the bones of ancient things pressing up through the skin of the land. The main house was solid and simple, built from adobe and timber, with a wide porch that faced west and caught the last hours of afternoon light. There were outbuildings, a barn, a smaller structure that might have been a bunkhouse at some point, and beyond them, a pasture where a dozen horses moved slowly through the late afternoon heat. The man who came out of the barn when the wagon stopped was not at all what she had expected, though she could not have told anyone precisely what she had expected. He was tall, with the kind of lean, hard-worked build that came from years of physical labor, rather than from any deliberate effort. He had dark hair that was slightly too long, and a face that was weathered and quiet, the face of someone who had learned to keep his thoughts from showing too readily. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a few years older, and he moved with the careful, unhurried economy of a man who had long since stopped wasting motion. He stopped a few feet from the wagon and looked at her without saying anything for a moment, and she looked back at him with equal frankness. "Miss Aldridge," he said finally. His voice was low and even with a slight roughness to it, as if it did not get much use. "Mrs. Aldridge," she corrected, not unkindly, "though Nora is fine." Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible. "Isaac Whitfield," he said. He did not offer his hand immediately, then seemed to reconsider and stepped forward and held it out. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and businesslike. "You were warned about me," he said. "It was not a question." "I was," she said, "and you came anyway." "I needed the work," she said simply, "and I make my own judgments." He looked at her for another long moment, then gave a single short nod. "I'll get your trunk," he said. The house was clean but spare, the kind of clean that comes not from care but from emptiness, from the absence of accumulated living. There were no curtains on the windows, no small decorative items on the shelves, no rugs on the wide-planked floors. There was a good iron stove, a solid kitchen table with 2 chairs, a pantry that was adequately stocked, and a bedroom at the back of the house that she understood to be hers. Isaac's room was at the front, across a narrow hallway. There was a sitting room with 2 chairs and a fireplace and a wooden shelf holding perhaps 20 books. He showed her through the house in silence, pointing out where things were kept, and she followed and listened and asked 2 or 3 practical questions that he answered in the same brief, efficient way. When they reached the kitchen, he told her that he rose before dawn and ate whenever food was available, that he had no requirements about timing or variety, that the previous arrangement had been him fending for himself, and that anything she produced would be an improvement on that. "I'll have supper ready at 7, she said. He looked briefly surprised, as if the specificity of this was unexpected. "That's fine," he said. He went back out to the barn, and Nora stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, her hands resting on the edge of the table, and let the quiet of the place settle around her. It was a deep quiet, different from the suffocating quiet of her house in Santa Fe. That quiet had been the quiet of suppression, of things unsaid pressing against the walls. This was the quiet of space, of open land and empty sky, and a man who simply did not feel the need to fill silence with sound. She decided she could work with this. She made supper from what was in the pantry, a good thick stew with dried beans and salt pork, and some of the wild herbs she found growing in a clay pot on the windowsill, which surprised her because they had been watered recently and were healthy and green. A small, careful act of domestic maintenance that seemed at odds with the bareness of everything else. She set the table, found a proper lamp, and had everything ready when she heard his boots on the porch just before 7. He washed up at the basin outside, came in, and sat down. He looked at the table, at the lamp, at the bowl she set in front of him, and then he looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You planted those herbs," she said, sitting down across from him. "They were here when I moved in," he said. "Seemed a waste to let them die." She filed that away carefully and did not say anything more about it. He ate in silence for a while, and she ate too, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. After a time he said, without looking up from his bowl, "The stew is good." "Thank you," she said. He looked up then briefly, and there was something in his expression that was almost startled, as if gratitude expressed plainly was an unusual thing to receive or give. He went back to his stew. Nora looked out the window at the darkening sky and thought that this was the most comfortable she had felt at a supper table in 5 years. The first week settled into a rhythm that surprised her with its ease. She learned the geography of the ranch, which buildings held what, where the water came from, how the kitchen stove needed to be coaxed on cold mornings, which horses Isaac favored and why. She learned that he was not uncommunicative so much as he was selective, that when he did speak, it was because he had something worth saying, and that he listened with the kind of attention most people reserved only for conversations they considered important. She also learned about the warnings. On her fourth day at the ranch, a man named Cutter rode in from town, a broad-shouldered man with a salesman's easy manner and watchful eyes. He said he was there on business with Isaac, and Isaac met him at the fence line and they talked in low tones for a while. And even from the porch where she was shelling beans, Nora could see the tension in Isaac's back, the careful stillness of a man maintaining control of himself by force of will. When Cutter left, Isaac came back to the porch and stood there for a moment, staring after the departing rider. His jaw was set hard. "Old business?" she asked, without making it sound like a question he had to answer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I made some poor choices when I was young. Not all the people from that time understand that those choices are finished." She nodded and went back to her beans. "I expect that's something that takes a while to communicate clearly," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You're not going to ask what the poor choices were?" "Not unless you want to tell me," she said. He was quiet for another moment and then he said, "I rode with a man named Deckard Vane for 2 years when I was 22. We moved cattle that weren't ours across the territory line. I stopped when a man got hurt because of it. I turned information over to the marshal and walked away." She kept shelling beans. "And Cutter was with Vane. He was. And he wants something from you." "He always wants something," Isaac said. "I just have to make sure he understands he won't be getting it from me." She looked up at him then properly, for the first time with the full attention she gave things she wanted to understand. He looked back at her steadily, neither defensive nor apologetic, simply honest. "All right," she said. "I'll start keeping the kitchen door latched when strangers come." Something passed across his face that might have been relief or gratitude or both. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I want to," she said. "It's my kitchen," he almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but the corners of his mouth moved in a direction that suggested they remembered how, and she thought that was probably enough for now. The town of Harlan's Crossing had, like most small towns in the New Mexico territory in those years, the particular social texture of a place that had grown up fast and was still figuring out what it wanted to be. There were good people in it and less good people. People who had come west for honest reasons and people who had come to escape whatever they'd been before. And the mixture made for a community that was simultaneously close-knit and wary, full of opinions about everyone and cautious about sharing too many of its own. Nora went into town every 2 weeks for supplies, and she did so alone, because Isaac did not come into town more than once a month, and she had no interest in being dependent on someone else's schedule. She drove the smaller wagon herself, which raised a few eyebrows in the beginning, and she bought what she needed at Mrs. Crane's general store, and she was polite to everyone and friendly to some of them, and within a month she had established herself as a known and accepted presence in the town's daily life without ever particularly trying to. Mrs. Crane, for all her initial wariness, turned out to be a woman of genuine warmth once she decided someone was worth her regard. On Nora's third trip to the store, the older woman pressed a small bundle of dried lavender into her hands without explanation, and Nora thanked her and brought it home and hung it in her bedroom, and some small piece of the ranch's bareness softened. She told Isaac about it at supper that evening, not because it was important information, but because she had started to find that she wanted to tell him things. He was a good listener in the way that quiet people often are, and she had spent years in a house where her words were either ignored or corrected, and the experience of being simply heard was one she valued more than she could easily say. He told her in return that Mrs. Crane had once stopped a robbery at her store by throwing a jar of molasses at the would-be robber's head, and that she kept a rifle under the counter that she had never had to use but that everyone in town knew was there. Nora laughed at that, a real laugh, and it came out more freely than she expected, and she saw Isaac's face change when she laughed, a brief openness crossing his features before his habitual composure settled back into place. "You should laugh more," he said, and then looked as if he hadn't intended to say it out loud. "I think I might be starting to," she said, and looked at her plate, and they finished supper in a quiet that had changed its quality again, become something warmer and more complicated. It was on the third week of her time at the ranch that the first thunderstorm came through. The territory was prone to them in late spring, great towering storms that rolled down from the mountains to the north with astonishing speed, turning the sky green-gray and filling the air with the smell of rain and iron. Nora had grown up in Kansas before her marriage, and she had a respect for violent weather without a fear of it, and she watched the storm build from the front porch that evening with the pleased attention of someone watching something grand and inevitable take shape. Isaac came out of the barn just as the first thunder rolled across the valley, a low, resonant sound that she felt as much as heard, and she turned to say something about the color of the sky. He was not looking at the sky. He was standing at the edge of the porch, very still, and his face had gone pale beneath his tan, and his hands, she noticed, were gripping the porch railing with a force that whitened his knuckles. She turned fully toward him. "Isaac," she said. He did not answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the northern horizon where the lightning was beginning to flicker. "I need to check the horses," he said in a voice that was doing a great deal of work to sound normal. "I'll come with you," she said before she fully understood why. He looked at her sharply. "I don't need, I know," she said. "I want to." He stared at her for a moment, and the thunder rolled again, closer this time, and something in his jaw tightened, and he turned and walked to the barn. She followed. Inside, the horses were restless, moving in their stalls with the nervous energy that animals feel before storms. Isaac went to each of them in turn, speaking low and steady, and his hands on their necks and flanks were gentle and sure, and the horses settled under his touch, one after another. She helped where she could, opening the grain, checking the water, doing the small useful things that kept her hands busy and gave her a reason to be present without making her presence feel like surveillance. Outside, the storm hit with sudden intensity, rain hammering the roof of the barn and lightning cracking bright against the darkness. Each burst of thunder shook the walls, and Isaac went still every time, that same white-knuckled stillness she had seen on the porch, except that here, in the dark of the barn with the storm pressing down around them, she could see that it was not simply tension. He was afraid. She stood beside the last stall, a quiet bay mare who had pressed her nose against her hand and was breathing slow and steady, and she watched Isaac, and she did not say anything, and she did not look away. After the fourth great crack of thunder, Isaac turned and put his back against the stall door and slid down it, until he was sitting on the straw with his arms resting on his raised knees and his head bent forward. He was breathing in a deliberate, controlled way, the way someone breathes when they are trying to remember how. Nora sat down beside him, not close enough to crowd him but close enough that he would know she was there. The mare bent her head over the stall door above them and huffed warm breath down at the top of Nora's head. "You don't have to explain," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said after a pause. "Good," she said. They sat there while the storm raged, and the horses breathed around them, and the rain ran in silver curtains off the barn roof, and Nora did not ask questions and did not offer comfort in words, and did not pretend that what she was seeing was not what it was. She simply stayed. After a long time the thunder moved further south and the lightning became distant, and Isaac lifted his head and stared at the barn wall opposite, and some of the white tension left his face. "I've had this since I was a boy," he said quietly to the wall. "All right," she said. "It was not the kind of thing anyone talked about," he said. "No," she agreed. "I imagine not." He looked at her then sideways, and there was something in his expression that was rawer and more honest than anything she had yet seen from him. "Doesn't change what you think of me." "Why would it?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Men are supposed to be what other men decided men should be," she said, with a gentle firmness that surprised even herself. "That doesn't make it true or right." He looked at her for a long moment. The last of the thunder was rolling away south, a distant complaint now, something that had already happened. One of the horses moved in its stall and the straw rustled and the rain softened to a steady drumming. "You're a strange woman, Nora Aldridge," he said. "I've been told," she said, and he laughed. It was a short, rough sound, unused and unpracticed, but it was real, and it landed in the space between them like something precious and unexpected, and Nora felt it warm in her chest in a way she had not expected and did not quite know what to do with. They walked back to the house when the rain had slowed, side by side in the wet dark, and neither of them said anything more that night. But something had shifted between them, something quiet and irreversible, the way a door that has been long shut can suddenly stand open without anyone quite remembering the moment it moved. Cutter came back in late May. This time he did not come alone. He came with 2 other men, and he came in the evening when the light was going orange and the shadows were long, and he did not bother with pretense or pleasantries. He rode up to the ranch with his companions flanking him and called out for Isaac from the yard. Nora was in the kitchen. She heard the horses and moved to the window without being obvious about it, and she saw the 3 men and the way they sat their horses, and she went to the back of the house and retrieved the rifle that she had asked Isaac about on her first week at the ranch, the one he kept oiled and loaded in the closet beside the back door. She carried it to the kitchen and set it against the wall beside the window and stood where she could hear. Isaac came out of the barn, and he stood in the yard without going to the fence, a deliberate choice of position that kept him in his own space. "Cutter," he said, "you should move on." "I came to make you an offer, Whitfield," Cutter said. He had the kind of voice that carried easily across distance, a practiced voice. "There's a cattle drive going north in June. The man organizing it needs someone who knows the territory, someone who knows which ranchers to avoid and which officials to approach carefully. I told him I knew just the man." "You told him wrong," Isaac said. "He's paying generously," Cutter said, "and it would be a shame if certain information about certain old activities found its way to certain people before the new marshal settles in. Man's new to the territory, might be looking to make a name." The silence stretched. Nora picked up the rifle. "That sounds like a threat," Isaac said in a completely level voice. "I prefer to call it an observation," Cutter said pleasantly. Nora stepped out onto the porch. She did not point the rifle at anyone. She simply stood there with it, held casually in both hands in a way that made its presence known without requiring any dramatic gesture. All 3 men looked at her. "Supper's going cold," she said to Isaac, conversationally. Isaac looked at her for a brief moment, and something passed between them in that look, an understanding, a communication of shared intent. "You heard my answer, Cutter," Isaac said, turning back to the 3 riders. "And I suggest you consider carefully before you make observations to the new marshal. I gave my information to his predecessor willingly, and I kept copies of the response I received. A man who threatens people with old crimes they've already answered for tends to look desperate, and desperate men don't usually come out ahead." Cutter's face was still. His companions shifted on their horses. "I'll be moving on," Cutter said finally, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "For now." He turned his horse and rode, and the 2 men followed him, and the dust settled in the orange light, and Isaac stood in the yard watching them go until they were gone around the bend of the road. He turned and looked at Nora on the porch. She looked back at him. "Supper actually is getting cold," she said. He walked to the porch steps and looked up at her, and there was something in his face that was undone in a good way, something that had been held back for a very long time finally becoming unguarded. "Thank you," he said. "I told you," she said. "It's my kitchen. I protect what's mine." She carried the rifle back inside without looking at his expression, because she was fairly sure that if she looked at it directly she would not be able to maintain the composure she was currently managing by a thread. She heard him come in behind her, heard him wash his hands at the basin, heard him sit down at the kitchen table, and when she set his plate in front of him she kept her eyes on the table. His hand, very briefly, covered hers. She went still. "Nora," he said quietly. She looked at him then. His hand was warm over hers, broad and calloused and careful. "You are the most surprising person I have ever met," he said. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said, and did not pull her hand away, and they sat like that for a moment, his hand covering hers on the kitchen table in the evening light, while the last of the day's warmth faded outside and the stars began their slow business of appearing. She thought about Thomas then, not with grief but with clarity, the way you can look at something from the past and understand it more plainly because you are standing at a sufficient distance from it. She thought about how different a hand could feel when it belonged to someone who wanted nothing from you but your presence. She turned her hand over under his, just slightly. Just enough that her fingers rested against his palm. He did not move, but his thumb moved, a small, barely perceptible motion against the side of her hand. She went warm from her chest outward. They ate supper in a quiet that was entirely different from the quiet of their first evening. And after supper, she washed the dishes and he dried them, standing beside her at the basin, and they worked in the comfortable, coordinated silence of people who have learned each other's rhythms. And when the last dish was put away, she said good night and went to her room and lay in the dark for a long time thinking about the warmth of his hand and the careful way he had said her name. June came in on a wave of heat that pressed down on the territory like a hand. The days were long and bright and merciless, and the work of the ranch continued without pause, because heat did not excuse fences from being mended or horses from being fed or land from being managed. Nora found that she had naturally expanded her role over the 2 months she had been there, doing more than the original arrangement had specified, not because she had been asked to, but because the work was there, and she was capable of it, and she preferred to be busy. She helped with the horses, because she had grown up around horses in Kansas, and she trusted them in a way she had always trusted animals more than she trusted most people. She kept a kitchen garden that had been nothing but weeds when she arrived, and she coaxed it into producing beans and squash and herbs with a patience that Isaac watched from a respectful distance and occasionally remarked upon. She also wrote letters. Not to anyone specific at first, just to the habit of it, the way you maintain a practice, because it keeps a part of yourself alive. She had written in her journal through all 5 years of her marriage, small, careful words in small, careful handwriting, and the habit had preserved something in her that she might otherwise have lost. Isaac found her on the porch one evening in mid-June, writing in the blue light of early dusk, and he sat down in the other porch chair without asking if he was intruding, because by that point they had moved past that kind of question. "Who are you writing to?" he asked. "Myself, mostly," she said. "Though I should write to my sister in Albuquerque, she'll be wondering if I've been murdered out here in the wilderness." He was quiet for a moment. "I can understand why she would be uncertain," he said, with a note of dry humor that she had come to recognize as one of his primary modes of expression. She laughed. "She knew where I was going," she said. "I told her about the position." "What did she say?" Nora considered this. "She said that I had always done things the hard way." "Is she wrong?" Nora looked at him. He was looking out at the land, the evening light lying golden across the flat distance, and his face in that light was unguarded in the way it sometimes was when he was not thinking about being observed. "No," she said. "She's usually right about that kind of thing." He turned to look at her, and for a moment they just looked at each other, and the evening air was warm and smelled of sage and dust, and somewhere out in the pasture a horse called softly to another. "Is this the hard way?" he asked. His voice was quiet, carefully neutral in a way that she had learned meant something behind it was not neutral at all. "I don't know what it is yet," she said honestly, "but I know it doesn't feel hard." He held her gaze for a moment longer and then looked back out at the distance, and she saw the corner of his mouth move in that almost smile. She went back to her letter. The night of the second thunderstorm was hotter than the first had been, and it came up faster, the sky going dark in the time it took her to carry the evening dishes from the table to the basin. By the time she heard the first thunder, the lightning was already directly overhead, splitting the dark with white cracks that left afterimages behind her eyes. She went to the hallway and knocked on Isaac's door. No answer. She opened it. The room was empty. The window was open, and the curtain was moving in the first edge of the storm wind, and the bed was made with the spare tidiness that was his particular habit, and he was not there. She found him in the barn again, not tending the horses this time. He was sitting on the hay bales at the far end with his back against the wall, his arms around his knees, a lantern burning on the post nearby. His eyes were open, and he was staring at the barn wall with the focused, deliberate look of a man concentrating very hard on something that has nothing to do with where he is. She came in from the rain, her hair damp at the edges, and she picked up the wool blanket that was folded over the stall rail, and she went and sat beside him on the hay bales, closer this time than she had been during the first storm, and she unfolded the blanket and put it over both their shoulders. He looked at her. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm all right," he said, in the voice of someone who is not entirely all right but is working very hard at being so. "I know that too," she said. The thunder shook the barn, and he went rigid beside her, and without thinking she put her arm through his and held on, and he went still in a different way, a way that was not fear but something that was trying to understand an unexpected kindness. After a moment his arm pressed back against hers, and the rigidity in him eased, not completely, not without effort but perceptibly. "Tell me about Kansas," he said, after the thunder had passed. She was surprised. "What do you want to know?" "What it looks like." So she told him. She told him about the flat, enormous sky and the way the grass moved in waves that looked like water, and the way the town she grew up in smelled in summer, like hay and river water in her mother's garden. She told him about her father, who had been a farmer with a dry sense of humor and a great love of books, who had taught her to ride and to read and to be unafraid of open space. She told him about her sister Marcy, who was bold and funny, and had married a man in Albuquerque who ran a printing press and seemed to make her very happy. She did not tell him about Thomas, not that night. There would be time for that. He listened to all of it, and the storm moved across and through and away, and they sat on the hay bales under the wool blanket, and she talked and he listened. And when the last of the thunder was gone south, he said quietly, "I grew up in Colorado. My father was a miner. There was a shaft collapse when I was 11. She waited. He survived," Isaac said, "but he was different after, afraid of enclosed spaces. He never went underground again. He found other work, but the fear never left him." He paused. "I used to wonder how a man who had been brave enough to go into the earth every day could be undone by it. And now," she asked softly. "Now I know that fear isn't about bravery or the lack of it," he said. "It's just a thing that happens to a person. Something gets inside you in the wrong way and it stays. Your father's fear," she said slowly, thinking, "and the thunderstorm, the noise, she stopped. The sounds in a mine are like that," he said, groaning and cracking, and then suddenly everything coming apart. He was quiet for a moment. "I was there, outside the entrance, waiting with my mother. We heard it." She did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would be adequate to that. She just stayed where she was, her arm through his, the wool blanket around both their shoulders, the horses breathing in their stalls. After a while he said, "You're the first person I've told that to." "I'm honored," she said, and meant it completely. He looked at her and she looked at him, and they were very close together on the hay bale, and the lantern threw warm light across both their faces, and she could see, very plainly, that he was looking at her with an expression that was not remotely ambiguous. She felt the same expression on her own face and did not try to hide it. "Nora," he said. "Yes," she said, and the word contained more than its one syllable. He lifted his free hand and touched her face, just the side of her cheek, with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything, the same unhurried attention. She leaned into it just barely. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I haven't. It's been a long time since he stopped. I don't want to make a mistake with you." "Then don't make a mistake," she said. "I'll tell you if you do." That almost smile again, closer to a full smile than she had ever seen it. You would, he said. That's one of the things he stopped again. Finish that sentence, she said. He looked at her, and his eyes in the lantern light were dark and warm and honest, and he said quietly, It's one of the things I love about you. The word landed between them like something that had been traveling a great distance and had finally arrived. She felt it settle in her chest, warm and certain, and she thought that she had not known until this moment how much she had been hoping to hear it. I love you too, she said simply, because simplicity was what the moment required. He kissed her then. It was unhurried and careful, and exactly what she might have predicted from him if she had been asked to describe a kiss that was entirely him. And she kissed him back with all the certainty and feeling she had. And the barn was warm around them, and the storm was gone, and the horses moved quietly in their stalls, and everything that had been leading here since that first evening on the porch settled into place. They were careful with each other after that, in the way of people who understand that something new and valuable requires a certain kind of attention to grow well. Nothing changed dramatically overnight. They still took their meals together, still worked the ranch in their respective rhythms, still sat on the porch in the evenings. But everything had a different quality, the way familiar music sounds different when played in a new key. He touched her hand when he passed her in the kitchen, a light, deliberate contact that made her look up and smile. She brought him coffee in the barn in the mornings and stayed to talk, and he listened to everything she said with that complete attention of his that she had come to understand was not a common thing. He told her, in fragments and over time, more of himself than she suspected he had told most people, the years with Deckard Vane, the specific moment he had decided to walk away, the months after when he had bought this land and started building something on it with the deliberate patience of a man paying a private debt. She told him about Thomas. She told him one afternoon in July when they were sitting in the shade of the porch in the heat of the day, sharing water from the same canteen, and she told him plainly and without drama, the way she had come to tell him most things, because he received honesty without flinching. She told him that it had not been a violent marriage, that Thomas had never raised a hand to her, but that he had been cold and dismissive in a way that had eroded her over the years, the way water erodes stone, slowly and invisibly until the damage is structural. That she had been lonely in a way that was almost worse than solitude, because it came with a companion. That when he died, she had not felt the grief she thought she should feel, and that the absence of that grief had frightened her more than the grief itself would have. Isaac listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she was finished he said, "You have not been treated the way you should have been," which was simple and true and exactly right. "I know that now," she said. "I didn't for a while." "Do you know it now because you're here?" he asked carefully. She thought about that honestly. "I started knowing it on the way here," she said. "I think being here just made it clearer." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I want to treat you the way you should be treated." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "You already do." The heat broke in August, as it always does, in a way that felt like grace, the mornings going cool and sweet, the light changing from its summer white gold to something softer and more amber. The ranch was in good order. Isaac had managed to have a clear, final conversation with Cutter that seemed to have resolved that particular problem permanently. Nora gathered from Deputy Garrett, who had warmed to her considerably over the summer, that Cutter had left Harlan's Crossing for good and had been seen heading toward Arizona, which was the sort of information that made the whole of the following week feel lighter. The town had settled its opinion of Nora as well, or at least Mrs. Crane had, and Mrs. Crane's opinion tended to function as the prevailing wind in Harlan's Crossing. She had told several people that Nora Aldridge was a sensible woman with good instincts, and that she was clearly good for Isaac Whitfield, and that anyone who had a problem with the arrangement out at the Whitfield ranch was welcome to keep their problem to themselves. Nora found this out from the blacksmith's wife, a cheerful woman named Delia who had become something like a friend over the summer, and she laughed when she heard it and told Delia to thank Mrs. Crane for her endorsement. Isaac came into town with her in September, which was not his usual pattern, and she noticed the way the town watched them arrive together on the wagon, and she noticed the small shifts in people's expressions, and she found that she did not mind being observed. He helped her carry supplies, which she did not need help with but accepted because he offered it, and he stood beside her at the counter while she talked to Mrs. Crane, and he answered the older woman's questions about the ranch with more words than he usually used for anything, which Nora suspected was a deliberate offering of respect. On the way home, with the wagon loaded and the afternoon light going long across the land, he reached over and took her hand. She curled her fingers around his, and they rode the road back to the ranch in the kind of companionable quiet that is not empty at all but full of the particular warmth of two people who are glad to be exactly where they are. "I want to ask you something," he said when the ranch was in sight. "Ask," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was choosing his words carefully. "I want to ask if you'll stay," he said. "Not as the housekeeper, just stay." She looked at him. "I know it's a different question than the arrangement we started with," he said. "And you don't have to answer right now. I just want you to know that's what I want. I want you to be here because you want to be here, because this is your home, because he stopped. "Isaac," she said. He looked at her. "I stopped thinking of myself as the housekeeper around the second week," she said. He was quiet for a moment and then he said very quietly, "I know. I started thinking of this differently around then too." "I'll stay," she said. "You're sure?" he said, and it was not quite a question but it was asking to be affirmed. "I am entirely sure," she said. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He brought their joined hands up and pressed his mouth to the back of hers, a brief, warm gesture, and she watched his face as he did it, the care in it, the honesty of it, and she thought that she had spent her whole life learning to recognize the difference between a gesture performed for appearance and a gesture that came from the genuine interior of a person, and this was the latter without any question. They rode the rest of the way home, and the ranch met them with the comfortable familiarity of a place that has been lived in and cared for, and she felt it all around her as they pulled into the yard, the specific, particular feeling of a place becoming home. He spoke to her formally in October, on a Sunday evening when the light was going soft and the first real cold of autumn was threading through the air. He had been quieter than usual all through supper, the kind of quiet that contained something waiting, and she had not pressed it but had let him arrive at whatever it was in his own time. After supper they were sitting on the porch in the last of the evening light, and he stood up and stood beside her chair, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her with an expression of such complete seriousness and such complete care that she felt something in her chest tighten pleasantly. He reached into his shirt pocket and brought out a ring. It was simple, a silver band with a small inlaid piece of turquoise, the kind of thing made by a craftsman in the territory who knew how to make something beautiful and honest with the materials at hand. "I know I'm not an easy man to know," he said. "I know I come with complications. I know the people in town aren't all certain about me. I know I'm afraid of thunderstorms and that I have a past I'm not proud of, and I know you know all of that and it hasn't changed anything for you, and I don't think I've ever understood before this what it means to be known by someone who knows everything and stays anyway." His voice was steady, but she could see what the words were costing him in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he was holding himself. "Nora Aldridge," he said. "Will you marry me?" She stood up. She took the ring from his hand and looked at it, and then she looked at him, at this man who had been described to her as dangerous and difficult and solitary, and who had turned out to be one of the most honest, careful, and genuinely good people she had ever known. "Yes," she said, "with everything I am." He put the ring on her finger, and she put her arms around him, and he held her close with both arms, and they stood on the porch in the autumn evening while the first stars came out over the territory, and she could feel his heart beating steadily against her cheek, and she thought that she had been right to come here, right to ignore the warnings, right to make her own judgment. She was not always right, Not always wise, but she was right about this. They were married in November in the small white church that served Harlan's Crossing, by a circuit preacher who came through once a month and had an agreeable manner and a reassuring voice. The church was not full, but it was reasonably attended, because it turned out that more people thought well of Isaac Whitfield than had been immediately apparent to Nora, or perhaps to Isaac himself. Mrs. Crane sat in the front row with her hands folded and her face performing strict neutrality while her eyes were suspiciously bright. Deputy Garrett stood near the back, smiling broadly. Delia, the blacksmith's wife, had organized a gathering at the church hall afterward with food enough for twice the number of people present, which was the sort of thing she did naturally and without being asked. Nora's sister Marcy came up from Albuquerque for the occasion, arriving on the stage 2 days before the wedding with a large hat and enormous energy, and an immediate and apparently genuine liking for Isaac, which she expressed by interrogating him carefully for 3 hours on the first evening, and then pronouncing him acceptable in a tone that made him look very slightly alarmed. Nora had laughed until she cried and told him later that Marcy's approval was not easily won and was very much worth having. Marcy had pulled her aside on the morning of the wedding in the small room at the back of the church where Nora was checking her reflection in a small mirror that someone had propped against the windowsill. "You look different than you did in Santa Fe," Marcy said, studying her. "Different how?" Nora asked. Marcy considered this. "Like yourself," she said finally. "You look like yourself." Nora looked at her own reflection and saw what her sister meant. She had grown her hair a little longer, and the sun had put color in her face that she had not had in the city, and she was wearing a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself over the autumn months, and she looked like a woman who was in her right place. "I am myself," she said. "I think I've been getting that back." Marcy hugged her hard. "Good," she said. "I've missed you." The ceremony was brief and honest. Isaac held both her hands and said the words in his low, careful voice, looking at her the whole time with that complete attention that she had long since understood was his most characteristic and most generous quality, and she said her own words looking back at him, clearly and without hesitation. When the preacher pronounced them married, she thought she heard something that might have been a small sound from Mrs. Crane's direction, but could not be certain. He kissed her, and the small congregation applauded, and Marcy said something to Delia that made them both laugh, and Deputy Garrett shook Isaac's hand with visible enthusiasm, and the gathering afterward was warm and loud, and full of the particular pleasure of a community marking something good. That winter was a good one. Not easy, because winters in the territory were not easy, but good in the particular way of winters when you are warm inside, and the cold outside is simply weather rather than a threat. They had laid in enough wood and enough provisions, and the horses were well sheltered, and the ranch settled into its winter patterns, and they settled into each other's company with the ease of people who had always been comfortable together, but were now fully and openly so. He read to her in the evenings from the books on the shelf, and she had opinions about all of them, which delighted him in a way he did not trouble to conceal. She taught him to make the particular biscuits her mother had made in Kansas, which he claimed were the best thing he had ever eaten, and she suspected he was exaggerating but liked him for it. They argued about small things with the comfortable energy of people who are not afraid of disagreement, and the arguments always resolved themselves easily because they were never about anything that mattered. And the things that mattered they had already talked through with a directness and honesty that had become their shared habit. The third thunderstorm of their life together came in February, a winter storm that nobody expected, rolling in from the west in the middle of the night with a force that woke them both. Nora felt Isaac go rigid beside her when the thunder hit directly overhead, that same immediate, involuntary response, and she turned toward him in the dark and put her hand against his chest and felt his heart going hard and fast. "I'm here," she said quietly. He put his hand over hers. "I know," he said. They lay there in the dark while the storm did its terrible work overhead, and she stayed where she was, her hand over his heart, and he held her hand against his chest, and the thunder rolled and crashed and finally moved on, and his heartbeat gradually steadied. "It gets a little better," he said into the dark, "knowing you're here." "Tell me when it gets better than a little," she said. "I'll be right here until then." He turned his head and pressed his mouth to her hair. "I know," he said again, and the word was full of something she was very glad she had stayed to find. Spring returned to the territory in 1879 with the particular extravagance it uses after a hard winter, and the ranch came alive again in all the ways that had become familiar to Nora. The horses growing restless for open pasture, the kitchen garden demanding attention, the long evenings returning inch by inch as the days lengthened. In April, she told Isaac that they were expecting a child. She told him in the morning in the kitchen over coffee because that was where they had most of their important conversations, and she watched his face, and the thing that moved across it was something so unguarded and so large that she felt it like a physical thing. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he looked at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to her and took her face in both his hands and looked at her with an expression that had no calculation in it at all, just pure, open feeling. "Nora," he said. It was just her name, but it contained everything. She put her hands over his where they rested on her face. "We're going to be all right," she said. "I know," he said. "I know we are." The pregnancy proceeded well through the spring and into the summer. Nora was not inclined toward illness, and she was strong from 2 years of ranch life, and she continued to do most of the things she had always done with modifications that she made sensibly and without drama. Isaac's care for her during this time had a quality of focused attentiveness that she had not expected but should have, because attentiveness was his fundamental nature, and it simply expanded to include this new and vital thing. He drove her to town more often, not because she asked him to, but because he preferred to be present, and she found she did not mind. He read everything he could find about the subject, which in the territory in 1879 was not extensive but was not nothing, and he asked the doctor who passed through Harlan's Crossing on a regular circuit direct and practical questions without embarrassment, which the doctor seemed to find refreshing. Marcy came up from Albuquerque in September because she had appointed herself to be there, and her presence in the house for the final months made everything louder and better. She and Isaac established a relationship that was principally conducted through dry observations, traded back and forth at a pace that excluded most people who were not paying close attention, and Nora watched them and felt a deep, clean happiness about it. The baby was born in November, 2 weeks before the anniversary of their wedding, in the bedroom at the back of the house with Marcy and the local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Baca, in attendance. It was a long night, as such nights often are, and it was not easy, but it was not frightening, because Nora had around her people who knew what they were doing, and because Isaac sat just outside the door the entire time in the hallway, close enough to hear her voice. When it was done and the baby was wrapped and real, Nora asked for Isaac, and he came in and sat beside her on the bed, and she watched his face when Mrs. Baca placed the baby in his arms. The baby was a boy. He had a great deal of dark hair and an expression of profound indignation about the entire situation that made Marcy say from the doorway that he already looked like his father, which made Isaac smile, a full, real smile, the kind she had been coaxing out of him for 2 years and which still, every time, felt like a gift. "What do we name him?" Isaac asked, looking at the baby with an expression of complete wonder. "I thought James," she said, "after your father." He looked at her and she saw clearly that this mattered to him in a way that went deep. "James Whitfield," he said softly. "James Whitfield," she agreed. He held the baby carefully and looked at her over the small dark head, and the lamp was burning warm and the November wind was at the windows, and the house was full of warmth and people who loved each other, and she thought that this was the kind of thing she had not known she was traveling toward when she stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan's Crossing with her trunk and her practical nature and her willingness to make her own judgments. She had been warned about him. She had come anyway. She had found a man who was careful and honest and afraid of thunderstorms and building something real in the desert, and she had loved him and been loved by him, and the life they were making was nothing like perfect and everything like right. James grew in the way of healthy babies, steadily and with character, and the ranch grew too, adding a second pasture in the spring of 1880 and a larger barn that summer, which Isaac and 2 men he hired from town built over the course of 3 weeks while Nora cooked quantities of food that she later claimed were unreasonable, and James watched the proceedings from a blanket on the porch with serious dark eyes. Deputy Garrett came out to help for several days, because he had become in the last year something genuinely like a friend to both of them, and he was useful with a hammer and good company. He stayed for supper several evenings, and Nora noticed that he looked at Delia the blacksmith's wife with a particular attention whenever they were in the same space, which she mentioned to Isaac later. Isaac said he had noticed it too, and that Delia's husband had passed away the previous winter after a long illness, and that these things sometimes took time. Like us, Nora said. We were not slow, he said with some dignity. We were appropriate, she agreed, laughing. He looked at her over James's head, because James was sitting between them on the porch blanket, examining a wooden spoon with profound interest, and his expression was one she had catalogued by now in all its variations but never gotten tired of. Appropriate, he said. Yes. Marcy came again for Christmas of 1880, arriving with her husband this time, a quiet, gentle man named Edward who published the Albuquerque Gazette and had an abiding interest in the history of the territory. He and Isaac spent most of 2 evenings deep in conversation about things Nora and Marcy were happy to leave to them, while the sisters sat by the fire and talked as they always had, with the ease of people who know each other completely. You were right, Marcy said on the last evening, when the men were putting James to bed, which had become Edward's particular responsibility over the course of the visit on the grounds that he claimed it was educational for a boy to be read to by someone who understood the printing press. About what? Nora asked. Coming here, Marcy said. Making your own judgment. She paused. He loves you in a way that's very good to see. I know, Nora said. He's very good at it, actually. Once he started, Marcy smiled. And you? Are you good at it? Nora thought about this honestly, the way she thought about all things honestly. She thought about the 2 years they had been married and all the things she had learned about herself and about him, and the ways they had been good for each other and the ways they had also sometimes been difficult, as all honest things between people sometimes are. I'm getting better at it, she said. I think that's probably the best answer. The spring of 1881 brought good grass after a wet winter and 2 new horses, and the letter that Nora had been half expecting since the previous summer, which was Marcy writing to say that she and Edward were expecting their first child, and could Nora please come for a visit in June. Nora told Isaac at supper, and he said of course she should go, and she said she would only go if he was all right managing the ranch and James together, and he gave her a look of mild offense that she thoroughly enjoyed. She went to Albuquerque in June with James, who was now a walking, talking, opinionated small person with his father's dark hair and his mother's directness, and the visit was everything it should be, full of warmth and the particular happiness of a family that has chosen each other as much as it has grown. Marcy's baby, a girl they named Clara, arrived at the end of June while Nora was still there, and Nora held her new niece and thought about her own son and her husband back in the desert, and felt the full, particular richness of a life that has become genuinely hers. She wrote to Isaac every 2 days while she was in Albuquerque, because she had gotten into this habit and also because she wanted to. His letters back were brief and specific and contained, consistently, 1 sentence near the end that had nothing to do with practical matters and everything to do with the plain fact that he missed her. She kept all of them. When she came home in July, the ranch was in excellent order. James ran to his father first because they had been together all month, and James was at an age where his father was the great hero of his small world, which Nora found entirely correct and not the least bit diminishing. Isaac came to her after, while James was occupied with the small carved horse he had been given as a homecoming present, and he put his hands on her face the way he had when she told him about the baby, and he looked at her for a long moment. "Good visit," he said. "Perfect visit," she said. "Clara is beautiful. Marcy is very happy." She paused. "And I've been ready to come home since the second week." Something in his face softened. "This is your home," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I wanted to be here." He kissed her, and James looked up from his wooden horse and said, with considerable interest and no self-consciousness whatsoever, "Kissing again," which made Nora laugh into Isaac's shoulder. The autumn of 1881 was one of the most beautiful Nora could remember, the kind of autumn that the territory produces when it is in a generous mood. All clear blue skies and golden light and temperatures that were exactly what you would choose if you had the choosing of them. The horses were sleek and well fed, and the barn was solid and full, and the kitchen garden had given generously through the summer, and was now being put to rest for the winter with the particular satisfaction that comes from work done well. James, at nearly 2 years old, had developed a personality that was entirely his own and not simply a combination of his parents', though it contained elements of both. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's curiosity, and he had an additional quality that seemed to come from somewhere in his own particular nature, a serious and complete delight in the physical world, in the texture of things and the way things moved, and the sound that different objects made when they met. Isaac spent time with him in the barn and in the pasture with a patience and attentiveness that Nora watched with a quiet, full feeling in her chest. She had thought, early in her pregnancy, about Isaac's own father and the way fear had remade him after the mine collapse, and she had wondered whether the weight of that history would make Isaac anxious in his own fatherhood. But he was not anxious. He was simply very thoroughly present. One evening in October, when James was in bed and the house was quiet, they sat by the fire in the sitting room, and Isaac was reading and Nora was doing the small mending that accumulated regardless of the season, and she looked up at him in the firelight and thought, with a clarity that sometimes ambushes you in quiet moments, that she was completely and unreservedly happy. Not the happiness of things going well, which is pleasant but contingent, but the deeper happiness that comes from being exactly where and who you are supposed to be. She said it aloud, because she had long since stopped editing herself in his presence. "I'm completely happy," she said. He looked up from his book. "I just thought I should say it," she said. He put the book down. He looked at her for a moment, and his expression had that quality it got sometimes, that particular openness that she knew was the most honest thing she ever saw from him. "So am I," he said. "Good," she said. "I'd hate to be the only one." He reached over from his chair and took her hand where it rested on the arm of hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that by the fire while the autumn wind talked to the windows and the fire burned orange and certain, and James slept in his room down the hall, and the ranch sat solid and real around them in the desert dark. In December she told him she was expecting again. He received this news with the same unguarded wonder as the first time, which she had quietly hoped for and was pleased to find. He held her for a long moment in the kitchen, and she heard him breathe slowly and deliberately, processing it, and when he pulled back to look at her, his face was lit in a way that she would have described to anyone who asked as beautiful, because it was the right word even though it was not one people usually applied to weathered, spare-featured men in their mid-30s in the New Mexico territory. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. "James will be outraged," he said, with the dry humor that she had come to love as one of his particular gifts. She laughed. "He'll adapt," she said. "He's resilient." The second baby came in August of 1882, during a stretch of heat that made the territory feel like the inside of an oven. But the birth was easier than the first, and the baby was healthy and loud, and had Nora's lighter coloring and an expression of curiosity that Marcy, who had come again for the occasion, said was entirely familiar. It was a boy again, which surprised them both slightly, not with disappointment but with that mild surprise of expectations not quite aligning with reality. "What do we name him?" Isaac asked, sitting beside her with the baby in his arms again in the same position in the same room, but everything changed by the fact of James sleeping down the hall and 2 years of life lived fully between then and now. "William," Nora said. "My father's name." Isaac said it carefully, trying it on. "William Whitfield." "William Whitfield," she said. James, who was brought in to meet his brother the next morning, studied the baby for a long, serious moment, and then said, "Small," in a tone of comprehensive observation, and then went on with his mourning, which Nora told Marcy later was essentially the ideal response. The years that followed those years had their particular textures and their particular events, the way all years do. There were good seasons and difficult seasons. A drought in 1883 that tested the ranch and the territory, and the hard work of getting through it and then rebuilding from it. There were town meetings and disputes and the slow, ongoing business of a community figuring itself out. And Isaac became, over time, a man whose opinion people sought on practical matters, not because he sought the position, but because they had learned that his judgment was reliable and his word was solid. Nora became, over time, a woman who was woven into the daily fabric of Harlan's Crossing in all the ways that mattered. The woman who knew which families needed help and provided it without making them feel beholden. The woman who could be counted on for honest counsel and practical assistance, and a quality of presence that people found steadying. They were, together, the kind of couple that becomes a fixed point in a community's sense of itself. The people around whom other people's lives organize without anyone particularly planning it that way. James grew into a serious, capable boy with his father's gift for patience and his mother's gift for directness. And he was good with the horses and better with numbers. And by the time he was 8, he had organized the ranch's supply records in a way that Isaac admitted was more efficient than what he had been doing before, which was high praise from a man who did not give it lightly. William was different from his brother in most respects and similar in the ones that mattered, and he had a quality of openness and easy warmth that brought people to him naturally, and he was always the child who knew every person's name in any room. And then in the spring of 1884, Nora told Isaac she was expecting a third child. He received this news sitting on the porch in the evening light, and she watched his face go through its familiar progression of wonder and warmth and the particular steadiness of a man who has learned to hold good things without being afraid of them. "Third," he said. "Third," she said. He looked out at the land, at the long familiar view they had shared from this porch for 6 years, the red rocks and the flat distance and the evening sky doing its work of becoming gorgeous. "I hope," he said, and then stopped and reconsidered, because he was a man who chose his words carefully. "I hope this one is a girl," he said. "I think James and William would benefit from it." Nora smiled. "They would definitely benefit from it," she said. The third child was a girl, born in November of 1884 during a thunderstorm. The irony of this was not lost on either of them, and when the thunder broke directly overhead in the middle of the labor, Nora, between breaths, said, "Of course," in a tone that was wry enough to make Mrs. Baca, who had been doing this long enough to have seen everything, actually laugh. Isaac sat outside the door again, as he always had, in the hallway in the dark with the storm overhead and his hands pressed flat on his knees, breathing deliberately, doing the hard, slow work of managing what was in him while his wife did the harder work on the other side of the door. He was afraid, but he stayed. He had learned over the years that staying was the entire thing. That staying in the storm, in the fear, in the love, in the life, was the only real practice that mattered. He heard the baby cry, and the fear broke open into something else entirely. Nora named her Eliza after her own mother, and the name suited her immediately and absolutely, the way some names do. Eliza had red gold hair that nobody could account for from either side of the family, which Marcy, delighted, called a gift from the universe. And she had a disposition of such complete and confident charm that by the time she was a year old she had wound every person on the ranch, and several in town, entirely around her smallest finger. Isaac, who had said with complete sincerity that he hoped the third child was a girl so that James and William would benefit, turned out to be the most thoroughly undone by Eliza of anyone, which James and William accepted with the equanimity of older brothers who have seen their father's principled positions tested and found wanting before. The December of 1884, with 3 children and 6 years of marriage and all the accumulated weight and warmth of a life made together, was the first winter that Isaac did not leave the house during a thunderstorm. It was a small storm, not a big one, but a real one, arriving at supper time and making itself known with thunder and lightning while they were all still at the table. James, who was 5 and curious about everything, asked his father why lightning came before thunder, and Isaac, with Eliza on his lap and William beside him and Nora across the table, told him, clearly and correctly and with the patience of a very good teacher. Nora watched his face the whole time. She saw that he was aware of the storm. She could see, in the slight set of his jaw and the careful quality of his attention, that the fear was present, as it probably would always be present, because some things get inside a person in the wrong way and they stay. But he stayed too. He stayed at the table, talking to his son about lightning and sound and the speed of both, and Eliza pulled on his collar with one small determined hand, and William ate his supper with great focus, and the storm moved through outside and he sat at the center of his own life and let it move through. After supper, while she was washing up and the children were in the process of going to bed, which was a process that always took longer than theoretically necessary, Isaac came to stand beside her at the basin. He picked up a dish towel. "You noticed," he said. "I always notice," she said. He dried the dish in his hands carefully. "It's better," he said. "It's been getting better." "I know," she said. "I've been watching it get better." He set the dish on the shelf and picked up the next one. "You've been patient about it." "I haven't been patient," she said. "I've just been here, that's different." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a low, completely genuine voice, "I don't know what I would be without you here." She turned to look at him because some things deserve to be looked at directly. He was looking back at her with all of himself in his face, this man she had been warned about and had come to anyway, this man who had built something real out of hard work and honesty, and a past he had answered for and a future he had chosen carefully. "Something good," she said firmly. "You would still be something good. You were before I came." He looked at her for a moment. "But better with you," he said. "Yes," she said, "better with you too." She turned back to the basin, and he kept drying, and they finished the dishes in the companionable, perfectly ordinary quiet of 2 people who have built a life together dish by dish and day by day and storm by storm, and it was entirely, completely enough. The following spring, when the territory was new and green, and the horses were glad to be in the pasture, and James had taken it upon himself to teach William to ride with a seriousness of purpose that Nora found deeply gratifying, she wrote a letter to her sister in Albuquerque. She told Marcy about the winter, about the children, about the ranch and the new pasture and the horses. She told her about Isaac and the storm at supper and what she had seen in his face. She told her about the conversation at the basin and the ordinary completeness of it. And then she wrote, "I know you said I always do things the hard way. I've been thinking about that lately, and I think you were right, but I think the hard way was right too. Not hard in the sense of difficult, though it has been difficult, but hard in the sense of real, solid, worth the weight of it. I came here with nothing but a trunk, and the opinion that warnings say more about the people giving them than the person they concern. I found a man who is decent and honest and more complicated than the warnings suggested and less dangerous than they implied, and who has been afraid of thunderstorms since he was 11 years old, and who loves our children and this land with everything he has, and who loves me with the kind of love I didn't know was something I was allowed to have. I think that's the whole of it, really. I came, I stayed, and it turned out that staying was the whole answer. She folded the letter and set it on the kitchen table, and went out to the porch to watch the afternoon, and after a while she heard Isaac's voice from the pasture, where he was with James and the horses, patient and steady, the same voice he used in the barn during storms, the voice that meant I'm here and it's all right. The territory stretched out in every direction, red and gold and enormous and indifferent and entirely beautiful. And the house behind her was solid and warm and full of the accumulated weight of their living. And Eliza was sleeping in her crib, and William was somewhere making friends with something that should probably not be his friend, and James was learning to ride under his father's patient instruction. And Nora Aldridge Whitfield stood on her porch in the afternoon light of the New Mexico territory in the spring of 1885, and felt the particular, specific, irreducible happiness of a person who is home. She had been told he was dangerous. She had moved in anyway. She had found a man who was afraid of thunderstorms and who had learned, with her beside him, that staying in the fear was not the same as being defeated by it. She had found a home. She had found herself. She had found the whole of it. And in the years that came after, as James grew into a young man, who managed the ranch with a skill that pleased his father and a record-keeping system that his mother was unreasonably proud of. As William grew into a person of such open warmth that it seemed the whole territory wanted to know him. As Eliza grew into a girl who was going to be whatever she decided to be. And everyone who knew her was already clear on this point. As Isaac grew into the kind of man that a territory grows around like a tree grows around a fence post, slowly, permanently, fundamentally altered by the presence. As Nora herself grew into the fullness of who she had always been becoming, the ranch sat solid at the eastern edge of Harlan's Crossing, and the porch faced west and caught the last of the afternoon light, and the herbs grew in the clay pots on the windowsill, and the storms came through sometimes as they always would, and they weathered them together. Every one.